Audio story, The Butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo, in Ryu. Step into the twisted mind of one of the most terrifying serial killers in history, Andrei Chikatilo. This immersive audio story uncovers the darkest crimes ever committed in the USSR. The story takes you through chilling details, psychological insights, and the final downfall of the man who haunted a nation. Headphones recommended for full effect. Subscribe for more true crime audio stories. Where I was, there were corpses left behind. He killed more than 50 people with particular cruelty and eluded the law for 12 years. Studying the remains of Andrei Chikatilo's victims, detectives sometimes refused to believe that these crimes were the work of a sane man. The investigation was inclined to the fact that children and teenagers are killed by a mysterious psychopath. In 1983, they had the opportunity to confirm their hunches during the investigation of an episode that went down in the history of domestic forensics as the case of the fools. I felt that if the girl screams louder, I will start to have this pleasure. I began to pinch her painfully. She, pulling out, screamed furiously, and at once I started everything. I was traveling in a tram, and I saw the number 52. I think here I have 52 corpses. Andrei Chikatilo was born on 16th October 1936 in the village of Yabloknoye, Kharkov region. When the Great Patriotic War began, he was only 4 years old. His father went to war. Soon he became the commander of a partisan detachment, and the care of the boy and his older brother Stepan completely fell on the shoulders of his mother, who worked in the local state farm. For the Chikatilo family, as for the whole country, came the hardest time. It is possible that the psyche of Andrei affected the terrible pictures of the war years, the consequences of bombing and the bodies of the dead, which were taken to the burial sites on carts. And at the end of 1942, the Germans came to the village Yabloknoye. Having collected some of the local residents, the fascists led them to be shot. Curious boys, including 6-year-old Andrei, ran after them. The children did not realize that after shooting the adults, the Germans would open fire on them. In front of Chikatilo's eyes, peers of the same age were falling, cut down by bullets. At some point, Andrei tripped and, hitting his head on a rock, lost consciousness. He woke up among the bloody bodies. The SS thought he was dead and threw him into the pit with the others. From fear, Andrew could not move and lay among the dead until the morning. In 1943, Chikatilo had a younger sister, Tatiana. This story in the family was shrouded in mystery. After all, the girl was born at a time when the head of the family has been at the front for a couple of years. According to some reports, Andrew's mother could get pregnant after being raped by a German soldier. Be that as it may, after the birth of Tatiana, the Chikatilo family was on the verge of survival. To somehow stifle hunger, he had to eat even grass and roots. At that time, he had the main fear of his life, the fear of being eaten. According to Andrei's mother, this was the fate of his older brother Stepan, who was kidnapped and eaten by neighbors mad with hunger. There is a version that the boy was actually eaten by his own relatives, but it has no reliable confirmation. The fight against the Nazis for Andrei's father ended in German captivity, where he worked in a mine and spent some time in a concentration camp. Roman was freed by Allied troops, but at home he was waiting for the camps of Komi and Chuvashia. There, sick with tuberculosis, Chikatilo Sr. was sent because of suspicion of complicity with the Nazis. Having survived in a concentration camp, he did not survive the Soviet camps. As for Andrei, the war years did not spare his psyche, and he already had problems with his health. Even at birth, doctors found signs of cerebral hydrocephaly in the boy. Later, neurological symptoms only intensified due to several concussions. Andrei went to school at the age of 8 in 1944. At the same time, he was a very absent-minded and timid student. Forgetting at home notebook and ink, Chikatilo was shy to ask for help from classmates and teachers, and just sat and cried. Sometimes the schoolboy fell under the desk in a hungry faint. Andrei despaired of the fact that he could not see what was written on the blackboard. He suffered from myopia. By the way, Chikatilo began to wear glasses only after 30 years, when he stopped being afraid of the offensive nickname for him, Ochkarik. Hysterical behavior of Andrew turned into constant ridicule and abuse from his peers. They beat the teenager, teased Baba and swagger, and he did not dare to give them back. All my life about me wipe their feet, did not consider me a man everywhere, will complain Chikatilo many years later. Meanwhile, in his school years, Andrei was really fascinated by politics. Chikatilo said that by the time of Stalin's death on 5th March 1953, he, a 16-year-old teenager, had such a deep knowledge of Marxism and Leninism that he could easily rule the Soviet Union. Translated with deepl.com, free version. After graduating from school with almost an honors degree, Andrei had only 1B in German, the 17-year-old decided to become a lawyer and applied to Moscow State University in 1954. However, he could not get in, did not pass the competition. However, for himself, Chikatilo found another explanation. He, as the son of a repressed, simply closed the way to the prestigious university. But the dream of higher education, Andrew did not leave and, having graduated from technical school, thought to become an engineer of railway transport, entering the correspondence department in the capital's institute. But after 2 years, Chikatilo abandoned his studies, and at the age of 23 went into the army. First went to the prestigious, at that time the KGB border guards in Central Asia, and then, thanks to the education received, went to serve as a liaison officer in Berlin. According to some reports, during the service, Chikatilo could become a victim of sexual abuse by fellow soldiers, which left another imprint on his psyche. After demobile, Chikatilo decided to start life with a clean slate, moved to the Rostov region and got a job at a telephone exchange. Along the way, Andrei began to write notes on various topics for local publications as a freelance correspondent. Life was getting better. In 1963, Chikatilo married and entered Rostov State University at the correspondence department of the Faculty of Philology. After receiving his diploma, Chikatilo decided to become a teacher. In 1970, he got a job as a teacher of Russian language and literature at a boarding school. Everything seemed to be going well, but the 34-year-old teacher began to show strange behavior. He began to harass female pupils. Pretending to be a caring teacher, Chikatilo would sit down with schoolgirls, ostensibly to explain difficult moments in their studies. And he himself would start touching the girls. And sometimes Andrei would wait until the students began to prepare for bed and undress, and then suddenly entered their bedroom. Soon the talk about inappropriate behavior of the teacher reached the management of the boarding school, and Chikatilo himself gave a reason for dismissal. On one of the warm days, he took his charges swimming at a local reservoir. At one point, Andrei noticed that one of the senior schoolgirls swam far away. Feigning concern for the girl's life, the teacher swam up to her and began to harass her. The schoolgirl began to fight back, and Chikatilo suddenly realized that he was excited by the screams and resistance of the teenager. But this prank cost him his job. Chikatilo was forced to write a letter of resignation at will. In general, some oddities in sexual behavior and difficulties in the intimate matter manifested themselves in Chikatilo in his school years. According to his own recollections, he received his first sexual satisfaction when he was a 10th grader. One day, his 13-year-old friend came to visit his younger sister, but neither Tatiana nor their mother was at home at that moment. And Chikatilo, feeling aroused at the sight of blue knickers that peeked out from under the guest's dress, attacked the girl. He threw her on the floor and himself lay on top of her, and already from this he experienced satisfaction. And although the schoolgirl did not understand anything, Chikatilo himself was ashamed of his act. After this incident, he decided that he would have sex only with his own wife. Chikatilo decided to marry at the age of 25, but his chosen one answered him with a sharp refusal and said that she would not tie her life with an impotent man. More than that, before refusing Andrei, the girl discussed his intimate problems with her friends. As a result, the whole village where Chikatilo lived learnt about it, and he himself once again became an object of ridicule. His later attempts to have sex with women were invariably unsuccessful, and Andrei, recognizing himself as impotent, tried to kill himself several times. Chikatilo eventually married Feodosia Odnacheva, a friend of his sister Tatiana, who introduced them at the age of 27. Chikatilo and Feodosia, whom he affectionately called Fialochka, lived peacefully, though the couple had problems with their intimate life. But despite impotence, Andrew still became a father. A daughter and a son appeared in his family 3 years apart. At the same time, secretly from his wife, Chikatilo regularly went to prostitutes. In 1978, having managed to work briefly as a master of the training process in the city vocational school, 42-year-old Chikatilo moved with his family to the city of Shakti. There, he took a job as a tutor at a local school. The deviations in his behavior became more and more noticeable. Unashamedly, he stuck his hands in his trouser pockets and touched his genitals in front of the students. They, in turn, showered the teacher with ridicule and teased him directly to his face as a pervert and onanist. It all ended with the fact that one day Chikatilo put his hand in the pants of his 15-year-old pupil. The teenager raised a ruckus, to which his peers fled. They mobbed the pedophile and beat him up. After this case, the teaching career came to an end. The first murder, Andrei Chikatilo, committed in the same 1978. Having moved to Shakti, Chikatilo secretly saved 1,500 rubles and bought a dilapidated house Mazanka, where he took girls of easy behavior. On 22nd December, he lured an 8-year-old girl into this dwelling, promising to treat her to imported gum. But as soon as the trusting child went inside, the maniac threw the victim on the bed and began to tear off her clothes. The girl screamed loudly and began to fight back, which further agitated Chikatilo. Having experienced sexual satisfaction, the maniac stabbed the schoolgirl several times in the stomach and then strangled her. Having abused the body, he took it out of the house and threw it into the local river Grushevka. As soon as the deceased was found, investigators began interviewing local residents. Some of them remembered. They saw the murdered in the company of a strange man. A sketch was drawn up, and a little later the director of the vocational school, where Chikatilo worked, confidently identified his employee in him. Andrei's wife, in a conversation with detectives, kept silent about the strange things that began to happen to her husband recently. In an inadequate state, he ran away somewhere, then returned, looking for something, and ran away again. Moreover, Feodosia lied to investigators that on the day of the murder Chikatilo was at home, so the maniac had an alibi. Meanwhile, the guards of order were in a hurry to report to the management on the successful detection of the crime before the new year. While some detectives were talking to Chikatilo's wife, their colleagues detained a certain Alexander Kravchenko, previously convicted and served 10 years for the murder of a little girl. Kravchenko's wife assured that her husband was at home on the day of the crime. Kravchenko was initially released, but was soon brought back to the police station. He had stolen from a neighbor. The operatives put a drug addict in the cell to the suspect, who beat Kravchenko, demanding that he confess to the murder of the girl. He could not stand the abuse and signed a confession. At about the same time, the police intimidated Kravchenko's wife. They promised to involve her as an accomplice if she did not confess to giving false testimony that her husband was at home. In the end, the operatives achieved their goal. Chikatilo was immediately forgotten, and Kravchenko was tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Later, under pressure from the relatives of the dead girl, his case was reconsidered and he was sentenced to execution. Andrei Chikatilo himself went into hiding after the first crime. He was afraid that the next murder would result in his capture. However, a few months later, the maniac killed a 17-year-old vocational school student. According to some reports, the girl earned a living as a prostitute, and she herself agreed to go with a stranger on the deserted shore of the Don. Chikatilo tried to have sex with her, but once again failed, and the student laughed, and also says, "The machine, you do not work," and starts laughing. Of course, it pissed me off, because I was embarrassed. I started to diffuse my psyche. I cut up everything without looking, recalled the maniac. His second victim was waiting for a terrible death. Chikatilo bit off the victim's nipples and stuffed her mouth with dirt so that she suffocated. At the investigation, the maniac himself confessed to this crime and the first massacre of an 8-year-old girl. However, the prosecution failed to prove these episodes. But Chikatilo's involvement in the next murder of a 13-year-old schoolgirl with whom the maniac massacred in June 1982 was proven in full. Following her in the same 1982, the maniac killed 6 more children aged 9 to 16. He looked for his victims at railway stations, bus stops, in trains and buses, looking for children who were without parents. Chikatilo got acquainted with them, rubbed his trust in them, and took them away with him under various pretexts, promising entertainment, chewing gum, or something else. Sometimes the children followed their killer for several kilometers. Chikatilo abused them, dismembered them while the victims were still alive, cut off their genitals, cut out their entrails. Detectives who followed the trail of the maniac at first thought that they were dealing with an employee of the morgue, a lot of knowledge about the rules of autopsy of bodies. The sex of the victims did not play any role for Chikatilo. Much more important was the fact that because of their young age, they could not fight back against the maniac. Killing, he felt his power and authority over the victims. But still, when choosing the next target for massacre, Chikatilo favored teenagers with blonde and straight hair. When killing his victims, Chikatilo gave free rein to his sick fantasies. Sometimes he used the knife blade as a dildo, thrusting it into the victim's body and making movements characteristic of sexual intercourse. But the most important thing for the killer was to gouge out his victim's eyes. According to some sources, Chikatilo read somewhere that the retinas of the victims can imprint his portrait, which he was very afraid of. According to others, the maniac felt shame and guilt in front of the victims and did not want them to look at him at the time of the crimes. Parts of the bodies of the dead Chikatilo sometimes took with him. His wife recalled that the maniac always took with him on business trips a small pot, and the killer himself admitted that he cut out the genitals of his victims in order to eat them. He read somewhere that such a method improves potency. As for the clothes and shoes of the victims, Chikatilo cut them into pieces and scattered them in the neighborhood. On the clothes of the maniac constantly left traces of blood and dirt. Sometimes Chikatilo washed them off in the public toilets of railway stations. Later, the maniac admitted that for this case he sometimes caught the police, but no interest in them he did not cause. Studying the remains of victims, Chikatilo, detectives sometimes refused to believe that these crimes, the work of a sane man. The investigation tended to the fact that children and teenagers are killed by a mysterious psychopath. In 1983, they had the opportunity to confirm their conjectures during the investigation of an episode that went down in the history of Russian criminalistics as the Case of the Fools. In September 1983, during an attempt to steal a tram in the Pervomaisky district of Rostov-on-Don, a 20-year-old pupil of a boarding home for the mentally handicapped, surnamed Shaburov, was detained. The young man not only did not deny his guilt, but confessed to another crime, the theft of a car, Moskvich. And then he told, together with his friend Kalanick, who also had mental problems, they killed 2 children, a 12-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Soon the second suspect was brought to the department. Kalanick turned out to be even more talkative and told the detectives about 2 more accomplices. They were also detained, having taken upon himself the murder of 7 people. From the testimony of the suspect Kalanick. In August, at the suburban railway station of Rostov-on-Don, I met a girl of 6 to 7 years old whose parents went to buy tickets, put her in trolleybus number. 1 drove to the Nakhichevan Bazaar, crossed to the other side, sat in trolleybus number. 11 drove to the final stop. He took her to a grove, took off her dress. He raped her in the usual and perverted form, burned her clothes. The fact that the corpse of a boy, not a girl, was found at the scene of the crime did not confuse the investigators. The boy's diagnosis seemed to explain everything. The suspects also described the circumstances of other crimes in detail. They told how they got acquainted with their victims and took them to deserted places, how they abused, raped, and killed them. However, after a while, the detainees unanimously retracted their testimonies and then confirmed them again. But because of the peculiarities of the suspect's psyche, the investigators did not attach much importance to it. Afterwards, it would turn out that the investigators helped the suspects to testify. They asked questions in such a way that the detainees did not even understand what they were talking about. As a result, it was easier for them to say yes than to try to get into the essence of the case. True, the mystery of the case of the fools is still how unmistakably the suspects indicated the places where Andrei Chikatilo massacred his victims. However, it is quite possible that the detectives simply took the detainees for investigative experiments in the right places. But while the defendants in the case of the fools were under arrest, in Novoshaktinsk and Shakhty continued terrible murders. From September 1983 to the beginning of January 1984, several girls and 2 boys became victims of an unknown criminal. The maniac stabbed one of them more than 70 times. Investigating these massacres, the Soviet police again committed negligence. In September 1983, Chikatilo killed a 22-year-old tramp. The girl suffered from oligophrenia, and the maniac easily lured her into a forest thicket. The body of the victim was found by local residents shortly after the murder and immediately reported to the police. But the operative group that left did not find the place described, and in order not to continue the search, the guards of order preferred to destroy the statement of eyewitnesses. It was only when someone came across the body again in November that the detectives finally bothered to find and examine the scene of the crime. But it was of little use. The body had time to decompose. Despite the fact that the murders continued, the detectives persistently followed a false trail dealing with the case of the fools. A few more mentally retarded people were detained, who confessed that the recent massacres were their work. Meanwhile, in January and February 1984, 2 female bodies were found in Rostov's Aviator Park. After that, detectives detained another mentally ill suspect, a disabled man who molested passers-by. That immediately confessed to the crimes, which he did not commit, and could not commit because of physical disabilities. Among Rostov citizens spread terrible rumors about a gang of madmen, which operates in the city and the surrounding area. But then the investigation of mysterious murders was entrusted to a new investigative team led by Isa Kastov, and his detectives quite quickly found all the inconsistencies in the investigation. Case of the Fools was terminated in 1985, and all the suspects were released. However, one of the detainees died in a pre-trial detention center before being released. One of those who tried to help the operatives in their hunt for Andrei Chikatilo was psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky. He carefully studied the case files and drew up a fairly accurate psychological portrait of the maniac. In particular, the specialist suggested that the killer, most likely a family man, looks good and definitely does not belong to the marginalized. Otherwise, he was unlikely to be able to gain the victim's trust so easily. Bukhanovsky also pointed out that the murders are most often committed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, with bodies found near the railway line where the Novocherkassk-Rostov trains run. Based on these observations, the psychiatrist assumed that the maniac had a shift job or traveled on business trips, and most often traveled by public transport, such as trains or buses. Moreover, Bukhanovsky even made a list of professions, where he indicated the supply industry, where Andrei Chikatilo worked. But the psychiatrist's portrait of the maniac did not help the law enforcement agencies in any way. And even at the moment when the killer, who fell under all of Bukhanovsky's criteria, was detained by the police. It happened in the autumn of 1984. That year, 15 people died at the hands of the maniac, and by that time Andrei Chikatilo had committed a total of 32 crimes. One night, a district inspector serving at the Rostov bus station noticed a 47-year-old man in the company of a young vagrant. It was Chikatilo. The policeman detained him and took him to the station. Operatives were immediately alerted by the contents of the suitcase of the detainee: a jar of Vaseline, rope, soap, and a knife. Besides, as psychiatrist Bukhanovsky predicted, the detainee worked as a supply man and was constantly on business trips. But then the investigators were tripped up by experts. Studying the traces of semen left by the maniac after another crime, experts mistakenly identified the suspect's blood type 4, and the detained Chikatilo had the second. He quickly found an explanation for the contents of the suitcase: Vaseline for shaving, soap for hygienic procedures, and rope for tying up the cargo. The policeman believed Chikatilo and let him go. However, soon after the story at the bus station, the maniac was caught stealing a battery and spent 3 months behind bars, until December 1984. Once free, Chikatilo, who by that time had acquired the nicknames Rostov Ripper and Citizen X, moved with his family to Novocherkassk, where he got a new job. But he did not change his profile. He again became a supply clerk, which allowed him to still go on business trips, the first murder after the move Chikatilo committed in August 1985. While on a business trip to Moscow, he went to the airport to get a ticket. During the train journey, the maniac met a 16-year-old girl and got off after her on the Aviatsionnaya platform on the pretext of walking her home. The way lay through the forest. Once in a deserted place, Chikatilo threw the girl to the ground, tied her up, and tried to commit sexual intercourse. However, the killer once again failed. Sexual satisfaction he received only by cutting the victim with a knife and cutting off her nipples. Less than a month later, the maniac got a new victim, a 17-year-old girl, with whom he met at the bus station in the city of Shakhty. This time, Chikatilo did not cut out the victim's uterus and cut off the nipples, although later in interrogations admitted, without this crime did not give him full satisfaction. Going on the trail of the killer operatives, seeing that the crimes continue, went to an unprecedented operation, codenamed Lesopolosa. It was allocated about 10 million rubles. Fantastic money in those days, when the car Zhiguli Vaz 2101 cost 8,000 rubles, and 200 rubles was considered a good salary. In April 1986, helicopters were taken into the air and circled over Rostov's forests and fields, while plain-clothed policewomen were constantly on duty at railway stations and on electric trains. They acted as bait for the maniac to fall for. At the same time, their male colleagues patrolled the carriages, all commuter trains in the Rostov region without exception. Auto and railway stations were also under observation. The guards were looking for all suspicious men who fell under the previously drawn-up portraits of the maniac. The policemen were assisted by vigilantes, in the ranks of which was Andrei Chikatilo himself. Having realized the scale of the operation, the killer decided to lie low. As a result, Forrest Belt helped in solving more than 1,000 other crimes: murders, thefts, robberies, and rapes. Law enforcement gathered information on 50,000 people with sexual behavior disorders. But the operation never achieved its main goal: the capture of Citizen X. Meanwhile, investigators were working through an endless stream of new leads. Skeletal remains of previously discovered victims were sent to a Moscow institute, where experts reconstructed the victims' appearances based on their skulls and created composite sketches. Police checked over 160,000 motorists and 2,000 individuals previously convicted of sexual offenses. Because many of the victims were boys, Chikatilo had attempted to sexually assault. Suspicion also fell on all homosexual men in the Rostov region. Investigators even tried to obtain a confidential list of names from a legal advisor at the Rostov Dermatological and Venereal Disease Clinic, who had a file of over 1,000 homosexuals. She refused to hand over the information and warned the detectives that they were pursuing the wrong lead. She argued that most homosexuals were emotionally sensitive and incapable of such savagery. As it turned out, she was right, but not before over 400 innocent men were interrogated. Some committed suicide, while others died during brutal interrogations. Their hearts simply gave out. And yet, Chikatilo continued to kill. In May 1987, during a business trip to Sverdlovsk Oblast, he murdered a 13-year-old boarding school student returning to school after a weekend at home. Chikatilo later confessed to the killing during 1990 interrogations. The boy's remains had in fact been discovered back in July 1987, but due to the extent of decomposition, they were misidentified as female. His body remained unidentified in the morgue for 3 years. After 1987, Chikatilo shifted his focus primarily to young boys. In July 1987, he murdered a 12-year-old boy from Zaporizhzhia, who had wandered into the woods to smoke. In September, he lured a 15-year-old from Leningrad, promising him a fake doctor's note so he could skip school. The boy followed Chikatilo to his dacha and never returned. That same dacha became a death trap for a 9-year-old boy from Ilovaisk. The boy had a chance to escape. Friends invited him to join them while he was walking with Chikatilo, but he chose to stay with his new friend. Chikatilo crushed his skull with a metal rod, killing him brutally. In June 1988, a 15-year-old honor student from Zverevo accepted Chikatilo's offer to celebrate his enrollment in technical school at the dacha. After stepping off the train at Leshoz station, the teen walked about 1 kilometer with Chikatilo before the maniac attacked. Chikatilo pried open his mouth, sliced off part of his tongue, and ate it in front of him. He then stabbed the boy, disemboweled him, and cut off his genitals. Between February and August of 1989, Chikatilo committed 4 more murders: 2 girls and 2 boys. Afterward, he dug a grave in a cemetery in the town of Shakhty. Later, during questioning, he claimed it was initially meant for himself, supposedly to commit suicide, but instead it became the final resting place of a 10-year-old boy. Chikatilo encountered him on the way to a video salon and convinced him to come home to watch movies. Instead, he led the child straight to the cemetery, knocked him out with a hammer, assaulted him, and buried him in the freshly dug grave. The boy's mother searched tirelessly, visiting every nearby railway station and showing his photo to passengers. She even showed it to a middle-aged man with glasses, who kept adjusting them nervously. In 1990, when she saw news reports about the arrest of Andrei Chikatilo, she recognized him instantly. She told the police, who then questioned Chikatilo in custody. He calmly confessed and led them to the exact location where he had buried the child. Hoping to make progress in the Citizen X case, investigator Isa Kostoyev turned for help to another serial killer, Anatoly Slivko, known as the Honored Tormentor, who was awaiting execution. Slivko agreed to share his insights, but, due to his own psychological disorders, made several flawed assumptions. For instance, he believed there were two killers at large, one targeting girls, the other boys. Still, Slivko summed up the investigators' chances grimly. "It's useless. You can't catch someone like that. I know from experience." And in this, he was right. Chikatilo was never identified by profiling or police work. His arrest would come by chance. But before that happened, Citizen X claimed 8 more lives. 6 boys aged 10 to 16, one of whom had his intestines torn out, and 2 young women. One of them would become his final victim. On November 6, 1990, on a train traveling from Rostov to Likaya, Chikatilo met a 22-year-old woman who agreed to go home with him. He knew the area well and planned to kill her in a dense forest where he had murdered before. But he avoided getting off at the usual remote Leskos station due to increased patrols. Instead, he chose a busier stop where crowds masked his presence. His calculation worked. The officers on duty at the Lesostep station didn't notice the oddly matched pair. Once in the woods, Chikatilo attacked. The woman fought back, scratching him, and later, fragments of his skin were found under her nails, but she stood no chance. Chikatilo stabbed her repeatedly, mutilated her body, cut out her genitals, bit off her nipples, and then vanished into the forest. Chikatilo let his guard down. He figured that walking alone would attract less attention, so he decided to return through the Leskos station. At that moment, Sergeant Igor Rybakov was on duty. The officer immediately noticed the odd-looking man in a business suit emerging from the forest. He clearly didn't resemble local workers or weekenders. There were twigs and leaves stuck to his clothes. I observed him for about 15 minutes, memorized his appearance, introduced myself, showed my badge, and asked for his documents, Rybakov later recalled. Chikatilo kept calm. He claimed he was visiting a friend in the village of Donskoy and casually handed over his passport. The officer wrote down his information and let him go. There was no legal reason to detain him. Only later, when the body of a woman was discovered nearby and investigators began reviewing reports from local stations, did they notice a familiar name: Chikatilo. Surveillance was placed on him immediately. Unaware he was now under watch, Chikatilo continued to hunt, lurking near children, teens, and young women. His behavior confirmed investigators' suspicions. On November 20th, 1990, Chikatilo took a day off work and went to see a surgeon. The last victim had bitten his finger, causing an infection. After returning home, he grabbed a large jar and went out, possibly for beer, maybe kvass. But on his way back, he was intercepted by officers in uniform. He didn't resist and quietly allowed them to handcuff him. During the search, they found knives, a hammer, and the very shoes he had worn during the killings, as well as his infamous black briefcase containing rope and petroleum jelly. Still, Chikatilo said nothing. He knew the police had no hard evidence yet. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. The Ying 15-day legal detention limit was nearing its end. Without formal charges, they would have to release him. That's when, forensic psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky, was called in. It took him just 3 hours to get Chikatilo talking. Breaking down in tears, the killer began to confess. Before his trial, Chikatilo was held in solitary confinement at a KGB detention center. The authorities feared he wouldn't live to face justice. Some of the victims' relatives worked in the prison system, and there was a real risk they'd use their connections to kill him. Many wanted vigilante justice. At the trial, the father of a murdered boy, stabbed 42 times by Chikatilo, coldly said he wished for a lenient sentence, not out of mercy. He wanted to wait for Chikatilo's release, and do to him what he had done to his son. The trial was disturbing. Though ruled sane, Chikatilo acted insane. He insulted guards and judges, pulled down his pants, and exposed himself in court. Wherever I went, wherever I worked, there were bodies left behind, he told the court. It just happened that way, every year. I know I'm some kind of mistake of nature, some kind of filth. I became a wild wolf. I went feral in this society. Those who wanted to tear Chikatilo apart were barely restrained by the guards and the iron bars of the defendant's cage. He destroyed all of us. We'll judge him ourselves, women screamed from the courtroom. Paramedics were stationed on site, administering sedatives to those who needed them. Relatives of the victims fainted. As the serial killer described his crimes in horrifying detail, on October 14, 1992, the Rostov Regional Court sentenced Andrei Chikatilo to death by firing squad. The verdict was met with a storm of applause. From those present in the courtroom, the court established that Chikatilo operated from 1978 to 1990 across multiple regions, including Krasnodar Krai, Sverdlovsk, Rostov, Vladimir, Leningrad, and Moscow oblasts, as well as Uzbekistan and Ukraine. According to the original conviction, he was found guilty of murdering 52 people, 21 boys aged 8 to 16, 14 girls aged 9 to 17, and 17 young women. Chikatilo himself confessed to 56 murders, and law enforcement believed the actual number could be as high as 65. The convicted killer appealed the verdict to the Supreme Court of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. In 1993, the higher court cleared him of 9 murders due to lack of evidence. However, this did not change the final sentence. Thus, the official death toll attributed to Chikatilo stands at 43 victims. Shortly before his execution, Chikatilo was asked what he thought about the end of his life. He replied, "I've been in the afterlife for a long time already. They've killed me many times. I've been cut off from that world. There's nothing left of it for me." The most infamous serial killer in Soviet history was executed on the night of the February 13th to 14th, 1994. The executioner shot him in the back of the head. However, urban legends still circulate. Some claim Chikatilo was shot in a way that preserved his brain so it could be sent to Japan for research. Others believe he was never executed at all, but rather secretly sent alive to Japan for experimentation. Why Japan? No one really knows. Chikatilo's only son, Yuri, changed his last name along with the rest of the family after his father's arrest. But years later, he too ended up in court, convicted of rape, document forgery, and kidnapping. His hostage wasn't just terrified by the violence or abduction. What truly broke him was a single piece of paper. To completely dominate his victim, Yuri showed his birth certificate. and there in the farther field was written, Chikatilo, Andrei Romanovich. Andrei Chikatilo is dead, but his shadow still lingers in case files, psychological studies, and in the nightmares of those who crossed paths with this horror. His story is a chilling reminder of how long evil can go unnoticed when we choose to look the other way. This is a tale of soulless violence, a blind system, and a monster who wore the face of an ordinary man. And though his life ended with a bullet to the back of the head, the questions remain. How many more walk among us? You've been listening to the audio story of the most brutal serial killer in Soviet history. Take care of yourselves and your children. And so ends the story of Andrei Chikatilo, a man whose name became a symbol of fear, horror, and unthinkable cruelty. His crimes shocked a nation, his trial captivated the world, and his execution brought a sense of justice, but not peace, to the families of his victims. Thank you for listening to this chilling audio story. If this true crime journey gripped you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Until next time, stay safe and never stop asking what hides behind the eyes of a killer.